Okay, cool. So sorry, Benny, what did you say?
Do we have the link ready in case the Google Meet?
It shouldn't end because
Okay.
I have more premium now.
Okay.
So it should be fine. I think people here, I'll start admitting people then.
Yeah, that's great.
Hey everyone, welcome to the talk. I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes just to let the last few people join before we start. Cool. Should we make a start then?
Yeah, should we make a start?
Sure.
So hello guys, thank you for joining. I'm Benedetta or Benny, and together with Agno we have organized a series of talks called Tech Talks. I will just give you a brief introduction how the Tech Talk is structured. So the concept of the Tech Talk is to bridge the gap between climate, technology and sustainability. And the whole concept of it is to give people a space for open discussion on climate and tech topics with the help and the guidance of an expert speaker. So thank you all for joining, and I will leave Agno introduce our guest speaker for the night.
So it's my pleasure to introduce Audrey today. So thank you so much for coming. So Audrey's an expert on nature-based solutions, and she focuses on particularly on the intersection between climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and linking that to biodiversity and human well-being. So she's currently the program coordinator of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative at Oxford, and she's currently working on nature-based solutions case studies and scaling up nature-based solutions in the UK, and looking at climate and biodiversity in international policy agreements. And I didn't want to be too long on the introduction, so I'll let you have your time.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Yeah, it's really a pleasure to be here with you all. Thanks so much for joining. So I should be speaking for about 30-35 minutes, and then we'll have hopefully plenty of time for questions and discussion. So please kind of, if you're curious about anything throughout the presentation, keep your, if you have a burning question, you can interrupt, but otherwise, maybe better to kind of keep your questions to the end so we can have a fun discussion. Great. So I'm going to be talking to you today about nature-based solutions for biodiversity, climate, and well-being, talking a bit about the synergies, the trade-offs, and safeguards. So diving straight in, let's talk about what are nature-based solutions. So nature-based solutions involve working with nature to address societal challenges, providing benefits for both human well-being and biodiversity. So we have in this figure over here, this kind of complicated figure, I'll break it down for you. We have in the middle, written in black in the yellow sphere, nature-based solutions, underneath written in white, people working with nature. So that's kind of what I've read out to you. You have 4 different types of actions, which I'll go into on the next slide. So actions such as protection, restoration, management, creation. So that's underneath the white writing, still in the yellow sphere. Then you have the yellow arrows going out to the blue section. So in the blue section, these are what we typically think of as ecosystem services, or we're calling them multiple benefits, or really the language is even evolving to call them nature's contributions to people. So these are things that we typically think about, such as greenhouse gas reduction, flood and erosion control, for instance, but also cultural values, social capital, that kind of thing. And then the blue arrows are going out, and all these different kind of ecosystem services are supporting human well-being and biodiversity, and overall creating what we might want to call sustainable development. And then going back into the yellow sphere, right at the bottom, we have biodiversity twice in this diagram. So we have biodiversity at the top in blue, so actioning these or kind of implementing these nature-based solutions is creating benefits for biodiversity, because we're doing actions such as protecting nature, restoring nature, that kind of thing. But really importantly, all of these benefits, all the blue benefits that we see, are underpinned by biodiversity. So it is biodiversity, the existence of biodiversity, that allows for these benefits to be created. And I'll go into that further, but just kind of keep that in mind for now. So going into those 4 actions, what do nature-based solutions really involve, trying to make it a bit more concrete for us? So firstly, they can involve the protection. So this is kind of like the conservation of existing ecosystems. So for instance, land titling to protect indigenous territories tends to result in higher conservation outcomes. So they protect their territories from exploitation. Restoration, so restoring degraded or destroyed ecosystems. Management, so in the improved sustainable management of land and resources. So this can include agroforestry, agroecology, regenerative agriculture, these types of things. These would be considered nature-based solutions in certain cases, most cases. And lastly, creation. So this involves the establishment of what we call novel ecosystems. So anything in an urban area, of course, urban areas are novel, naturally, thousands of years ago, they weren't there. So anything involving urban greening, urban kind of water management, also artificial oyster reefs, which are sometimes really necessary for coastal resilience, and also afforestation. So there's a distinction between kind of reforestation, which would fall into the restoration category. So this is reforesting with native species in areas where for instance, in this case, forests naturally existed before human intervention. And then afforestation would fall into the creation category. This means kind of planting trees in areas that don't naturally have trees, or that didn't naturally have trees, or even kind of non-native species of trees, right? So just to make that distinction there. This over here is the official definition of nature-based solutions from the United Nations Environment Assembly, UNEA. And so I'm going to read this out, and then I'll go into kind of why this official definition is important. So nature-based solutions are actions to protect, conserve, restore, sustainably use and manage natural or modified terrestrial, freshwater, coastal, and marine ecosystems, which address societal, economic, and environmental challenges effectively and adaptively, while simultaneously providing human well-being, ecosystem services, and resilience and biodiversity benefits. So a massive mouthful, but these types of definitions are agreed upon through a multilateral process, which in this case involves all the countries which are party to UNEA, which are party to the UN Environmental Assembly, which is basically every country on Earth. There's a couple which aren't, but basically every single country in the world, their national governments have agreed that this is the official definition of nature-based solutions. And then once this is agreed, this was agreed pretty recently in 2022, last year. Once this kind of definition is agreed, it means that the term nature-based solutions, then wherever it is used, so if it is used in international policy, for instance, at COP27, COP28 coming up, that kind of thing, the definition needs to, it always relates. The term always relates back to this definition. And there's two important key factors or key things that I want to bring your attention to here in bold in the definition. So by definition, nature-based solutions must support and provide human well-being benefits and biodiversity benefits. So if an intervention does not have beneficial impacts on human well-being and does not have biodiversity benefits, then it should not be called or cannot be called a nature-based solution. So that's really key. So as I just mentioned, and this is really kind of, key, to qualify as a nature-based solution, an action must support or enhance biodiversity. And the concept, the NbS concept, is based on the science and knowledge that healthy biodiverse ecosystems produce a wide range of ecosystem services. So this is what I was kind of going on about with that diagram with the blue and the yellow, and you had biodiversity underpinning it at the bottom. All the benefits that you're going to get from nature are from healthy biodiverse ecosystems. And so this is why it's important to kind of clarify that biodiversity is not just a co-benefit. There's kind of this common language that has evolved in often the private sector, also civil society, that they're calling biodiversity a co-benefit of nature-based solutions, and we want to kind of fight against that and say that it's not a co-benefit, which makes it kind of seem secondary, but it's really a necessary precondition underpinning the successful provisioning of benefits from nature-based solutions actions. So I went into this a little bit, ecosystem services, why biodiversity is important, but really biodiversity secures all that we need from nature. And so ecosystem services, and moving past the term ecosystem services, which some find a bit utilitarian, a bit reductive, and to this kind of more inclusive term that is nature's contribution to people, which really involves spiritual value or cultural values and beyond. It's been found through many studies that higher biodiversity improves the flow and the resilience of these ecosystem services. And for instance, that biodiversity also increases resilience to climate extremes. So for climate adaptation, biodiversity is very important for this reason. And then it's also really important to remember that people depend on biodiversity. We all depend on nature, and it's really healthy ecosystems that ultimately sustain us. But 1.2 billion people in tropical countries, especially around the world, are highly and directly dependent on nature for really their basic daily human needs. So of course, here in the UK, especially living in cities, we are, of course, indirectly and often still directly dependent on nature. But it's important to remember that many people around the world are really highly and directly dependent for their basic human needs every single day. And also importantly, nature is of high cultural and spiritual value to many, which is critically important, and especially to many Indigenous peoples from across the world. And then diving into this, to the other part of the definition, specifying that nature-based solutions must provide benefits for multiple people. It's important to remember that nature-based solutions are for people and by people working with nature as part of nature. So it kind of works to break this kind of human nature dichotomy that has evolved in people's thinking, and recognize that humans and nature are not separate, recognize the plurality of different values that nature holds for people. So this means that many different people, many different cultures around the world will have different values, place different values on nature, and one isn't necessarily more important, and it's important to recognize the plurality, so all of these values at once as being important, recognized, etc. And so the extent to which nature brings benefits really depends on how we implement nature-based solutions, on the implementation, because all of this has been a lot of theory. But then if we think, okay, how does this happen in practice? That part is really, critically important. And so in the how, what must happen in the implementation, nature-based solutions must be designed, led, implemented, managed, and monitored by Indigenous peoples and local communities. So for instance, in countries like the UK, where there may not be kind of what we typically think of as Indigenous peoples, then, it goes to local communities. But a lot of these interventions are occurring in the global south, where there are high levels of biodiversity and also large and kind of strong populations of Indigenous peoples living in the places where these interventions are being implemented. And so Indigenous peoples and local communities must also be the primary beneficiaries of nature-based solutions. And it's important to recognize that Indigenous peoples and local communities have been stewards of the land and have been implementing NbS for millennia. So although NbS is kind of a new term, and of course I showed you, the definition by UNEA, it was only agreed upon last year, but NbS really involves, those actions, the protection of intact ecosystems, the restoration, the sustainable management of working land, agroforestry, these types of things. And people, especially Indigenous peoples and local communities, have been doing this for millennia. So it's really kind of nothing new, but it's almost like a conceptual framework and a terminology to group all these things together while putting these safeguards on them. So safeguards meaning that they need to have biodiversity benefits and benefits for people. And so actions that aim to support NbS, so for instance, kind of any policies that aim to support NbS, finance initiatives that aim to support NbS, must support them, so them being Indigenous peoples and local communities, to continue to do so, right? To continue to be the stewards of the land and to continue to implement NbS as they have been doing for millennia. And we really must let them lead when relevant and appropriate on NbS. But there have been a lot of concerns around nature-based solutions. It's become a little bit of a controversial term in some in some areas, and there's concerns, serious and very valid concerns, around greenwashing and around human rights. So what can happen is that people's rights can be violated and their livelihoods can be destroyed. So there's a high potential when we're talking about land, issues around land and different priorities around land and all these benefits, there's always going to be trade-offs. So trade-offs was in the title of my talk, and I think I don't actually have a slide on trade-offs, but it's kind of a reoccurring theme throughout my talk of thinking about these trade-offs, and it's something that we can dive more into in the discussion. But if we're thinking of kind of these different priorities, for instance, a global priority of climate mitigation, carbon sequestration, and then obviously local priorities involve different land uses. So this can sometimes result in these kind of conflicts of land grabs and exclusions, which of course are unacceptable, no matter, they should not be acceptable trade-offs. There's also concerns around that the NbS concept, is it disrespecting people's intimate connection with nature? Is it commodifying it, right? So integrated in the NbS term, we believe, academics who have been working on the term and who are kind of very familiar with the multilateral process of the definition, et cetera, that it really kind of integrates people and nature together. But the term has been miscommunicated in the private sector and in civil society. And many people find that the term is kind of commodifying nature. So that's kind of a debate to be had, isn't it? It's complex. There are serious concerns around greenwashing with carbon offsets and concerns and kind of bringing up the concern is NbS just a dangerous distraction from reducing fossil fuels. And there's also issues of additionality. So in the kind of whole carbon credit, carbon offset world, right? This term additionality is super key. There were a lot of kind of articles in the news. The Guardian investigation on Vera found that many of the carbon offsets that Vera was certifying actually did not have this additionality. So these areas that were kind of labeled as high-risk deforestation areas actually weren't, and they wouldn't have been deforested anyway. So there was no additionality. So that's a bit of a wormhole, but I can explain more if you ask questions about it later. and the idea of permanence, right? I'll go into that a little bit more in a bit. So we must ensure that nature-based solutions are implemented using a human rights-based approach with participatory and equitable governance. And so it's very important to double down on that definition. That's why I keep going back, and I spent ages on the very boring and wordy definition, that it must improve biodiversity and human well-being, to really reclaim the term from some actors in the corporate sector who are misusing the term, essentially. And there's also, that was a bit more on kind of the social science, human dimension side of the risks and concerns. There's also risks and concerns on the ecological side for biodiversity, in terms of the risk of NBS misuse. So in some cases, so-called NBS, and so it's really, we would not call these are not NBS because they don't adhere to the definition, but so-called NBS are undermining biodiversity. So they can be monocultures or afforestation in the wrong places, an excessive focus on tree planting. So for instance, there are many ecosystems across the world that should not have trees on them, right? These are natural grasslands, savannas, wetlands, peatlands. Tree planting on these ecosystems destroys the native biodiversity to that area. And so this can result in maladaptation. So maladaptation being kind of adaptation done badly with negative results. And so it's important to kind of remind and clarify and double down on this fact that monoculture plantations are not nature-based solutions, and that BECCS, so this is biocapture, bioenergy capture and storage, is not a nature-based solution. And as I mentioned with the tree planting, there are risks displacing other critical ecosystems such as wetlands, peatlands, grasslands, etc. So that was a bit about the risks, but let's think about some of the benefits, the potential benefits. So in terms of nature-based solutions for adaptation, nature can help us adapt to climate change in multiple ways. And this is really exciting. I think the term nature-based solutions has gotten a bit co-opted by the mitigation side of things, by the climate mitigation side of things, so carbon sequestration, all of that. But actually, the term NBS started in the realm of adaptation, and where its benefits are really the strongest, the clearest, and hold the most potential are really for adaptation. And this is why we really need NBS. So what kind of benefits can nature provide? Of course, these are some of the ecosystem services that we saw in the second slide, but some more examples here. So in terms of water, the regulation of water flows, of course, food security in cities. They can provide urban cooling, water supply and flood protection in cities. Infrastructure, they can provide slope stabilization, and in supply chain, sustainable production and rural livelihoods, and a lot of potential for disaster risk management and health. So really exciting stuff in the realm of adaptation. This is one example, or one kind of type of example. I'm getting a bit more granular about how nature-based solutions and natural ecosystems can help reduce exposure to extreme climate events. And so it's evidence from coastal ecosystems. And so this is a combination of many different types of nature-based solutions. So if we start from the left-hand side, you have these coral reefs over here, which which reduce wave energy by 97%. Then moving closer inland, you have seagrass beds. These further reduce the wave energy, so making the waves kind of less intense, right, when they come onto shore. So seagrass and salt marshes, and then you have mangroves, which also will reduce the wave energy, which will reduce the wave height. But then they also provide lots of other benefits. So some climate mitigation benefits when they sequester the CO2 when they grow, but also fish and invertebrates come to feed in all of these ecosystems, which provides obviously livelihoods and food for local fishermen, which can then increase their resilience to climate change as well. So we can kind of see here examples of how different types of NBS can be combined in one landscape to really kind of amplify the results that the benefits that they're providing to people. Going back to biodiversity here, it's really important to remember that biodiversity increases resilience, and it can also has been found to increase carbon storage potential. So one example is that in a 15-year-old tropical plantation in Panama, the kind of plantation plots that had higher species richness, so higher biodiversity essentially, were more resilient to mortality during a 4-year drought, right? So if you want resilience and if you want these kind of NbS actions to actually last and to provide the benefits, you need that biodiversity. And then the same for carbon storage. Actually, I was updating these slides, or rather kind of making these slides right up until before this started, because this is a study that came out today. So super exciting, a study from my colleague, Audrey Wagner et al., who works with me in this office, came out with an amazing meta-analysis today that she's been working on for years. So a meta-analysis is basically takes the results from a bunch of different studies. So I think, hundreds of different studies that have been done on this, and kind of looked at the overall kind of average results for all of these different studies. And her study really concluded that mixed planted forests, so forests with higher biodiversity, store up to 70% more carbon than monocultures. So yeah, really exciting to be able to kind of present a study that came out today. You can check out the whole thing by just kind of looking up Warner et al. Mixed forest meta-analysis. Okay, that brings us a little bit into talking about NbS mitigation potential, right, for climate mitigation. So NbS can help us to mitigate climate change. It does have a significant role, but we need to be really aware and careful of overestimation, right? Because there's really kind of been this rampant overestimation, people getting too excited about the mitigation potential of NbS, which has caused problems. So there are many limitations, some of which I'll go into, but a really key factor to consider is that further warming will compromise the potential or the performance of NbS. So the worse we let climate change get, the more climate change will negatively affect these ecosystems, which we are hoping will A, protect us from climate change, so adaptation, and B, continue to reduce the effect of climate change. And this, of course, is through fires, droughts, pests, these type of things. So it's kind of, almost like a vicious loop of the worse we let climate change get, the less NbS will be effective in helping us solve it, right? And so, okay, there's a lot of kind of challenges in estimating NbS potential, right? There's all these kind of modeling that goes into it. This graph over here is just a graph of the kind of wide variation of published estimates, right? So it's just basically all these different studies are showing, like, some show that it's like really big, some exactly, just kind of smaller, bigger, etc. So it just goes to show that it's kind of still really contested, and that there's all these different factors to consider when you're estimating mitigation potential. So if someone kind of tells you, okay, it's this, you kind of try to think critically about, the caveats, what did they include in their model, that kind of thing, right? But I'll try to put some numbers to it to give you kind of a ballpark figure here. So first, let's think about the emissions from the land sector, right? So we know that most of greenhouse gas emissions from anthropogenic sources are from fossil fuels. So we can see on this graph on the right, the large majority is from fossil fuels, but there's still an important fraction that is from agriculture, forestry, and other land use, which the acronym is IFOLU, right? So 22% is from the land sector. So of course, if we're thinking about nature-based solutions, they involve the land sector. There is high potential for NbS to really reduce this 22%, ideally to zero, completely reduce it through NbS. So that's a serious kind of potential that it has there. Okay, here's a bit of an estimate. So it is a study by someone in our group, Cécile Girardin et al. Back in 2021, showing that the number for mitigation potential is about 10 gigatons. And so this was done through modeling with different safeguards if NbS were to be kind of maximized, right? So 10 gigatons is kind of an easy number to remember. has a lot of agreement on this kind of 10 gigatons number. And so it's important to look at the breakdown there. So 40%, so 4 gigatons, right? 4 gigatons out of 10, 40% is from protecting intact lands. So the protection of forests that are there, example, the Amazon, etc. Another 40%, so another 4 gigatons, is from the whole management side of things. So improving our farming, making our farming less detrimental for the environment, implementing agroforestry, these kinds of things. And then 20%, so a smaller portion, is on the restoration, right? And it's just important to emphasize this because people get really, really excited about restoration, and everyone wants to go kind of plant trees, but it's just kind of important to think that only 20% of the potential of NBS is really kind of planting trees, and what's most important right now is to really kind of protect the trees that we have left, right, and stop deforestation. Critically, this is kind of the most interesting part of this study, and what we really like to emphasize is that nature-based solutions can make an important contribution to cooling this century. So they have the potential to reduce peak warming by 0.1 degree if we peak at 1.5, more likely to peak at 2 degrees. So if they would reduce peak warming by 0.3 degrees. And we know that every fraction of a degree really matters. So this kind of puts it into perspective where we know that every fraction of a degree really, really matters and will save lives and will prevent species from becoming extinct. So 0.3 degrees is super significant, but it's only 0.3 degrees. And so we need to just kind of be realistic. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of risks to NBS potential. So there are, on the biophysical side, biophysical risks such as fire, pests, drought, etc., which themselves will get worse with climate change. But then also on the governance and human system side, and this is kind of my specialty, on the human system side, you can have financial failure, you can have management failure. So for instance, illegal harvesting or kind of miscalculations leading to mismanagement of harvesting. You can have policy changes. So for instance, in Brazil, when the government changed from being a Lula government to a Bolsonaro government, deforestation increased drastically because of the policy changes and because of the lack of enforcement in the region. And there could be economic changes. So for instance, if global food prices changes, then that can, and even the price of oil, all of these things are interconnected. This can then lead to impermanence of NBS. And so how can we mitigate some of these risks? So again, drilling down this point of biodiversity. So in the terms of the biophysical risks, biodiversity can help with resilience to biophysical risks. And also interventions based on sound science can help minimize these risks. So what I mean by that is making sure that you have, if you're implementing NBS, that you're basing it on science, on ecology, that you have ecologists and biologists involved, making sure that you're planting the right species in the right place, that you're doing the right intervention for the right ecosystem, and kind of using the latest science on the different risks to each different ecosystems. And then on the human system side of things, good governance, which is kind of an umbrella for all these things, can help minimize risk. But of course, that's a kind of, what is good governance is a massive question. So on the top side, biophysical side of things, there's a key role for natural science research. And then on the human side of things, there's a key role for more social science research. So I hope this kind of, obviously you guys are studying at the moment. And so I hope kind of this maybe plant some seeds in your mind for kind of the research gaps and the need for further research to mitigate both of these types of risks, right? Both on the natural science side and on the social science side of things. This dives a little bit more into the social science side of things. So in terms of good governance, we're talking about participatory, inclusive, and equitable governance of nature-based solutions is key to ensuring the permanence of nature-based solutions and minimizing the risk to NBS potential. And so local community buy-in and participation in the design, implementation, monitoring, and monitoring is really crucial for the longevity and the success, because you could have a community that maybe kind of this intervention was a bit forced upon them. They're a bit disgruntled. They're not, they didn't really, they've said okay, but they're kind of like, and then, they could just cut down the trees a few years later because they didn't kind of feel invested and really kind of involved in the process, right? And again, here the importance of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So many studies have shown that the lowest rates of forest loss have been on Indigenous lands. And so really empowering Indigenous communities and through land tenure rights and other means is a really kind of key way to ensure that you have this longevity for NbS projects. Really important to note that nature-based solutions are not a substitute for decarbonization, and they're not an alternative to technological solutions. So I used to kind of be only interested in the ecology and nature and the nature-based solution side of things, but when I realized that everything happening on the technological side of things, everything related to energy efficiency and renewable energy is just as important or more really. It kind of gave me a bit of a different perspective. So we really must, so nature is not kind of the silver bullet solution, and we must use technology to decarbonize the energy sector, to decarbonize aviation, shipping, industry, transport. These sectors cannot be solved through nature. These are really through technology. And most importantly, we must keep fossil fuels in the ground, and we must get emissions down to as close to zero as possible, if not completely at zero. So we really need to adopt a combination of both engineered and nature-based solutions approaches to adapt to climate change. And again, NbS are not a silver bullet. And so here I just added these slides today. These are a couple of kind of news stories of when NbS have been used for greenwashing. So the first one is a kind of potential land deal happening between Liberia and the UAE. So the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, is of course where COP28 is going to be happening in maybe kind of less than a month now. So essentially, the UAE has proposed to buy up nearly 10% of the land mass of Liberia for carbon offsets, which is complete greenwashing and really, really awful. And then this was in the news literally today. I just saw it like a few minutes before this talk, and I thought I would include it. It's a case where Kenya's government is illegally evicting hunter-gatherers from their ancestral lands to profit from carbon offsetting schemes. So obviously it's completely awful. So we really need to make sure that these projects are not labeled NbS. Of course, they are not. They don't have that biodiversity component. They are complete greenwashing, and they're not at all respecting human rights. And so it's really important to kind of, this is one of our biggest concerns right now with COP28, all the kind of greenwashing that's going to happen in the name of so-called NbS. And so we want to keep doubling down on that UNEA definition and on calling and kind of making sure that no one is calling out, is calling these things NbS because they aren't. Here's also kind of some examples of some case studies. I know I'm running out of time here. I'm almost at the end. You can check this out in the science paper from Natalie Seddon, who's the director of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, to dive a bit deeper into these case studies. So you have good ones on the left-hand side, bad ones on the right-hand side. So again, the bad ones involve exclusion of Indigenous peoples for, non-native monoculture plantations. Ridiculous, awful stuff. But then on the left side, you have kind of interventions that went well, involved local people, were participatory, etc. And so coming to my last couple of slides here, we know that nature-based solutions can bring multiple benefits. So in summary, they do have some carbon sequestration benefits, although, we can't overestimate that. Huge benefits for reducing disaster risk, protecting ecosystems, conserving biodiversity, etc. And again, I mentioned this at the beginning, but really kind of moving away from this co-benefits term and from the dominant idea that kind of carbon sequestration is the primary benefit, and really kind of talking about multiple benefits and nature's contributions to people. And so given the benefits on the previous slide, nature-based solutions have a big potential to unite multilateral agreements. So the UNFCCC is the kind of multilateral climate agreement, right? That most people should know about. But then we also have the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. COP15, which just happened last year, was kind of a CBD COP. So this is all about kind of biodiversity. Of course, we have the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Ramsar is one all about wetlands. The UNCCD, the one at the bottom, is all about desertification. So NBS can really kind of provide multiple benefits to unite these international policy agreements. And so this has implications for the upcoming COP28, for the upcoming COP16 next year, really the importance of integrating the climate and nature agendas. And so we need to synergize. I'll describe these acronyms in a moment. So synergizing NDCs, NAPs, and NbSI. So what these are, NDCs are tools in the UNFCCC. So in the climate space, they're nationally determined contributions where countries will kind of declare how they will deal with climate change and mitigate climate change. Same thing, similar for the NAPs, that's on the adaptation side of things. So the NAPs are, again, in the UNFCCC, but basically each country gets to declare what are their plans for adapting to climate change. And then NbSI, that's within the CBD, the biodiversity side of things. So it's kind of all these, big kind of official policy documents that these countries come up with. The NbSI is basically countries' plans for how they're going to address biodiversity loss. So there's a need to synergize kind of between, because often what ends up happening is that a country will have their NDC, have their NbSI. It will be completely different people making them. There won't be connections. A lot of the actions will be repeated. There isn't kind of much organization with how these things really fit together and influence each other, and how can the finance be synergized, and the policies kind of not competing. Sometimes you even have policies which undermine each other. So we need to make sure that these are really kind of synergistic and kind of taken as a whole. And then even in the subnational planning, you really there needs to be kind of mainstreaming of climate and biodiversity action into all policies. So and all sectors. So, the health sector, the infrastructure sector, energy, we need to be thinking about climate and biodiversity into all of these sectors and take a whole of society approach and align the financing and reporting. So in summary, my last slide here, so these are our 4 guiding principles for nature-based solutions, and it's all a summary of what I've mentioned before. So number 1, most important, nature-based solutions are not a substitute for the rapid phase out of fossil fuels, and they must not delay urgent action to decarbonize our economies. So really kind of saying no to greenwashing, that kind of thing. Number 2, nature-based solutions involve a wide range of ecosystems. So this is kind of to really emphasize the importance of grasslands and wetlands and aquatic and marine ecosystems, and not just have this tyranny of tree planting, is what people are calling it. Number 3, super important, that nature-based solutions are designed, implemented, managed, and monitored by, or at least in close partnership with, Indigenous peoples and local communities through a process that fully respects and champions locals' rights, knowledge, and that generates local benefits. And number 4, that I kept kind of drilling down on since the beginning of my talk, nature-based solutions must support or enhance biodiversity. So thank you so much for listening. I know that was a lot, and I didn't leave that much time for questions, but we have 15 minutes here. So super excited to hear your questions. Thanks.
Lovely. Thank you so much for doing the presentation. It was amazing, and I've learned so much, and I think everyone here has too. I want to open it up to the floor for questions first. So does anyone have a question?
If I have one, maybe. So thanks so much, Audrey. This was such an interesting presentation. I think I'm kind of coming from the exact opposite side, where I'm coming, like, I've just been focusing on reducing fossil fuels, and now I'm realizing, like, wait, but we also really need this nature-based solution. So one thing that I kind of sometimes struggle with is I'm really annoyed with this obsession that some research going into direct air capture is taking, that people are like thinking of using energy kind of pump air through filters or something to get carbon out when there's so many places where carbon is way more concentrated than there. But then when I look at IPCC pathways or something, there's always like this big need of decrease in carbon in the atmosphere, because we're just not going to get there in time without sacrificing so much of how we live and growth for countries that are developing, etc. And so I'm wondering how you kind of see, is there any way to rebrand offsets? Because there is this kind of need for wealthier countries that are not managing to decarbonize fast enough to somewhat allow adaptation and avoid worsening of the situations like the one that you mentioned in Brazil. But at the same time, you can't have a sort of like, oh, I've offset it, now it's fine to use fossil fuels mentality. And this is where I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this aspect of, like, on the one hand, we want to encourage people that are unfortunately still driving a car or still having to take a flight to find a way to support this without relieving that pressure from needing to get rid of fossil fuels. And
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks so much for your question. And it's so funny that you literally said the words, I think, rebranding offsetting or something like that, because at the moment, so over the past year and a half, I've been co-chairing the process of rewriting the second edition of this document called the Oxford Offsetting Principles. And so this was a document that was written maybe like four years ago, and we weren't, it was a bit rushed. There's been huge uptake, but we realized that there was kind of some problems in the way that it was written, and then also kind of science and policy have also evolved, so there was a need to rewrite it. So we've been rewriting it in the past year, and then just a couple of weeks ago, we said, hang on, wait a second. Offsetting is not working, and so actually we're going to change the title, and it's no longer going to be called the Oxford Offsetting Principles. It's going to be called the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Balance. And so what we're doing with this kind of rewrite is we're essentially completely rebranding offsetting and saying that offsetting is not working. But then, yeah, on the other hand, we need, there are certain countries that need finance for these reduction and removals approaches, right? So reduction is like reducing emissions, but removals is kind of carbon dioxide removals, CDR, what you kind of talked about, Killian. So how do we get that finance there without, as you exactly say, compromising or kind of reducing the pressure on these people who have the finance to reduce their own emissions, right? And so in the principles, we talk about, the need to really, the number one thing is reducing your emissions, and only then you should offset. Again, we're not using the word offsetting anymore, but yeah, so essentially it's really the importance of reducing keeping banging on about the importance of reducing emissions as much as possible, and then providing what we're calling beyond value chain mitigation. So providing the finance through a kind of corporate social responsibility lens, that these companies have a responsibility to provide the finance for these types of kind of carbon removal projects, whether they're on the technological side or they're on the nature-based solution side, because of course, as you mentioned, we need finance for the other benefits of it, adaptation, biodiversity benefits, etc. But they're beyond value chain mitigation. So they're kind of saying, okay, we're not going to, we're basically giving you this money, and the benefit for us is that, it looks good on our reputation, but we're not actually doing it to kind of offset our carbon accounting. So they're essentially giving the money for offsetting without actually kind of adjusting the balance sheets on their end. So it's kind of one method and where things are going. Yeah, go ahead, Killian.
Yeah, so the kind of struggle that I have with this is always like the question of how much, right? And I think this kind of ties back into what you were saying about, like, we always have to watch out to not obsess on one metric. I think engineers and economists are great at finding a metric and then making the best of it. But then the whole drawback is here we're realizing that doesn't work. And what I found really hard is then how do you I think there maybe there's doesn't need this, and maybe I'm going too down the engineer route, but I feel like there's like a certain need of like, the more fossil fuels you're not able to mitigate now, the more you should have to support those that need to adapt and kind of support these other ways. And in a sense, offsets do that, right? Because there's this idea of like, okay, I'm currently emitting a certain amount of, using a certain amount of fossil fuels, and so proportionally to that, I need to pay this amount. And the problem is the amount is just way too low, and it's targeting something that it shouldn't be targeting, right? And so to find some way of like making it so that, okay, if you want to, and maybe there's no real level that is fully fair, right? Maybe whatever we can do is good, but I worry that like you can get this benefit of CSR impression that you're doing something when actually it's just not proportional, or it's not like at the right scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think what is really needed is pressure from civil society in those cases, and due diligence, right? So there's kind of, for instance, at Oxford, we have the net zero tracker, where my colleagues are tracking net zero pledges and then progress towards net zero pledges. And then there's similar kind of initiatives on the nature side of things. So it's kind of holding these companies to account and having, you know, the data publicly accessible from these companies and saying, you know, well, they're only doing this amount, and kind of calling them out. And yeah, these kind of tracker ways are different ways to do that. But it's a really thorny question, and I think everyone is kind of struggling with that at the moment, and that's why, you know, people are interested in offsets, but then obviously seeing all of the kind of consequences from them is really, rightly so, turning people off of them. But then what is the alternative? So I think it's really a live question at the moment, and it's a question that really goes into kind of finance, right? So how do we finance nature-based solutions, but also other actions? You know, we want a blend of public and private. How will that come about? What mechanisms will the private finance come through? What mechanisms exist? So then you kind of go into all these, you know, there's bonds and this and that. Yeah.
Thanks so much. I'm gonna let it open up for other people. I feel like I'm monopolizing it.
Not at all.
Cool. Thank you for your question. Anyone else want to ask a question? Cool, Haley, go ahead.
Hello, so just a quick, I think earlier in the presentation, you kind of mentioned that it's like really hard to quantify the effects of nature-based solutions, like exactly. And I think there was that graph where there was like a huge range of stuff. And I was wondering, like, how does this uncertainty play into different, like offset measures? Because I guess like if it's hard to quantify it, like, wouldn't it be hard to actually know the impact of an offset?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. So there's lots of uncertainty. Of course, the larger scale you go, so the more you go kind of global scale, the more uncertainty you're going to get. So when you look at kind of, you know, a very small plot of trees, there are robust methods for assessing how much carbon has been sequestered there, right? And so that's, you know, the types of studies that went into the Warner et al. Analysis are all kind of, you know, comparing carbon. So there's lots of ways to measure carbon being stored and sequestered in ecosystems. There's still a lot of science to be done. For instance, soil carbon sequestration is still kind of unknown. Of course, there's methods, but the kind of uncertainty bars are pretty high in some environments, but I'm sure the science will improve. But it's really kind of once you get to this kind of global scale where you need to factor so many different things in. So not only the biophysical potential, but then the political implications will greatly affect the potential economic will greatly affect. You know, you need to balance food security needs, other land use needs, different land rights territories. And so that's where kind of all the uncertainty comes in. Actually estimating just the biophysical potential is not that hard, but then was actually the main problem with all these kind of overestimates of nature-based solutions potential came from these studies, which were only talking about the biophysical potential. And so then people kind of took these numbers, just kind of plucked these numbers out from these studies and said, oh, this is the potential, when actually that potential is impossible. It's not at all realistic. You know, these types of things also depend on the price of carbon, etc. So many kind of factors on the social side of things. And that is really kind of what brings in a lot of the uncertainty. And so then with regards to offsets, just to mention kind of one more thing as an example, sometimes what you have in offset projects is that you have kind of a buffer pool, what is called a buffer pool. So you have kind of an area that you're saying you're offsetting for kind of this amount of carbon, which is like this amount of forest, but then you have other kind of areas of forest as that offsets buffer pool in case that goes up in smoke. So in case that goes up in smoke, they're saying, okay, well now, you know, we have this other one, so now we just need to kind of move some numbers around, which is a kind of work in progress. It is needed, but it's been done really kind of problematically, because often the buffer pools are not are estimated to be much too small, and the risk is estimated to be much too small when actually the risk is much larger. So actually these buffer pools should be much larger, etc. So that's kind of one way. This is kind of more like the uncertainty of permanence, but that's one way that uncertainty is managed in offsets.
That makes sense. Thank you.
I had a question, Audrey. So I come from an engineering background, and I'm interested in like civil engineering and structural engineering, and I recently look at kind of the carbon emissions associated with the construction industry. And there's been recently a lot of talk about replacing a lot of things with wood. So just making wooden structures. Obviously there are other hazards related to that, but to reduce the carbon emissions of the construction industry. But I was also interested in your presentation, in the slide where you showed how much protection does, like the impact of protection. And so I was wondering, what do you think of kind of shifting the construction industry towards wood? What would that mean with like deforestation and then like not protecting essentially biodiversity?
That's an interesting question, but I don't actually, like, I'm not a specialist in that exactly, so I don't know, and I haven't been exposed to any studies that kind of really show, you know, how much would that take. So I'm not sure, but it is, you know, I've also seen this type of thing, you know, kind of can we use natural products, or not natural products, but wood, you know, because if it's harvested, then it can also sequester that carbon that it grew if it's in a long-lived product. So used in a construction, compared to, for instance, wood that is just used for paper pulp, toilet paper, etc. Obviously is a short-lived, so it won't. So yeah, but then I guess it's a question of moderation, and also you would need to kind of look at the numbers to see, right? Because there's so many different competing land uses, and so there's probably an important role for that, but also limited, and that you don't want to kind of just go crazy with it, because of course that would increase competition for land, not only for NbS but also for food security and other land uses, which are super key. So that's what I would say for now. But then it's really interesting. I think I mentioned this kind of before the other people joined on the call, but there's so many really exciting opportunities of hybrid kind of engineer mix with kind of nature-based solutions structures for protection. So for instance, you could have a seawall, but also other NbS either kind of beyond the wall or on the other side of the wall, that could kind of help reduce the pressure on that seawall, that kind of thing. And then there's also, you really need to do kind of a lot of science and modeling around which structure would work, which kind of solution would work well in each case, because in some cases nature-based solutions just won't be enough. So if it's an area that is really being battered really frequently with these extreme events, sometimes, you know, say there's mangroves there, they won't have time to recover. And so actually you really do need kind of an engineered infrastructure in that location, or at least a hybrid combination. But yeah, it's a really exciting field.
Thank you.
Cool. I mean, we are very, very quickly encroaching the time, and I don't want to encroach into any of your evenings. To do we want to go for one more short question?
Yeah, we can have one more question. Yeah, I went over on my presentation. So I mean people can feel free to leave, but yeah, I have time for one more question, definitely.
Cool. Does anyone want to go ahead, or I've got a few as well, but open to the floor first.
Go ahead, Agno.
I'll go ahead. Yeah, so I was mainly wondering about in terms of if there's any specific criteria or like guidelines to ensure that NBS strategies are contributing positively to biodiversity, because it's sort of a hard thing to quantify or measure, especially when it's like scaled up. On a smaller scale, it's relatively somewhat measurable, but on a large scale, it's so much more difficult to measure. And like it would be really nice if there was a set of guidelines that like government and policy could look at.
Definitely, yeah. So I mentioned our kind of 4 guidelines, but of course those are super like high level, right? I actually didn't mention the IUCN global standard for nature-based solutions. So they have a much more kind of detailed set of guidelines. I can't remember how much there are, but you know, it's the kind of thing where there's like 20 types of guidelines, and then each one has a kind of very robust type of thing. So if you're actually implementing an NBS project, I would really encourage you to look at the IUCN global standard guidelines and global standard, and it gives you like a really kind of detailed breakdown of every single little thing to kind of think about, that kind of thing. I guess in terms of kind of the second part of your question, it's really important to always remember that nature-based solutions are always going to be place-based, right? So although, we're interested in kind of these global kind of big meta-analysis, global potential, that kind of thing, global effects, it's nature-based solutions will always be local and will always be place-based, and so they really need to be taken kind of on a case-per-case basis. And so that's why kind of the global standard from IUCN really kind of helps you assess, because there's like a self-assessment tool, so it helps you assess kind of your individual project. It can be over a large area of land, but I think these assessments do really need to be done project per project, case by case. And then once that research is in the literature, for instance, then you can have these other researchers doing kind of meta-analysis, right? So like Emily Warner did in my lab, she kind of took all these papers that were already published about, how much carbon was sequestered in here and here and here and here, and then you do a kind of big meta-analysis. And actually, I forgot to mention, but we had another paper come out a couple years ago in our lab by Izzy Key. She was at Oxford. I think she was an undergrad at Cambridge. Then she worked at Oxford for a little while, and now she's at the University of Edinburgh. And she did a meta-analysis on the biodiversity outcomes for NBS for adaptation. So basically she looked at all the literature that had NBS implemented specifically for adaptation, just because that just like narrows it down. And then she looked at all the biodiversity benefits, and then she came up with, like, I don't remember what the number was. It was something like 67% or like maybe higher, I don't know, 87%, I can't remember, had positive outcomes for biodiversity. So then you can kind of conclude that the majority of NBS implemented for adaptation have positive biodiversity benefits. And we have a similar paper and an accompanying like online evidence tool online, which was a similar kind of meta-analysis done by another one of our colleagues that looked at, what did it look at? I think I think it looked at the effectiveness of a bunch of different things regarding, so mostly related to adaptation. So it basically took a big look at kind of all NBS and literature, kind of published, mostly scientific literature published on NBS, and looked at what are kind of the average outcomes for food security, for flood resistance, and there was a bunch of different things, like 20 different things. And you can find that on our website. So yeah, but then these are kind of, I guess it points to the importance of doing this small scale research to come up with all these case studies. And then once you have all these different case studies in the literature, then you can kind of conduct this big kind of global meta-analysis. I hope that, I don't know, that was a bit of a tangent, but I'm not sure if that answered your question.
No, that definitely did. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Great. Well, thank you so much for having me, and I hope you guys, liked it. Feel free to reach out, check out our website, because as I mentioned, we have that evidence tool, but then we also have this like global map of nature-based solutions case studies, which has like 150 case studies from around the world of like good actual NBS. So that's kind of fun to explore as well. And yeah, happy to get in touch if anyone has any questions in the future.
Thank you so much.
Audrey.
Thank
It was
you.
lovely. Thank you.
My pleasure. Bye bye. Have a nice
Bye.
evening.
Okay. How is it? All good?
Yeah, all good. I thought there'd be more people, but it all worked
Yeah.
out. I mean, the people who were there asked some very nice questions, so we weren't.
I think what we have to make sure next time, I think it was a bit too little interactive, because like we should have made it an hour and a half or something, because
Yeah,
she
I didn't.
had
I
so
didn't.
much info, like
Yeah.
really good, but like a lot, so it kind of lost the kind of workshopy discussion based approach that we
Yeah.
discussed. But I thought
I
it was
guess
great.
it's also harder online, to be honest. Like the
Yeah,
discussion,
no, 100%. Like
it was also like a one-to-one conversation.
yeah, no, 100%. But well done, Agno. Thank you for organizing this and for finding the speaker.
I was so stressed about the premium Google Meet working, because I did get it, but like it didn't update anything on my Gmail. Like it stayed absolutely the same.
So you were
But
like, is it gonna
I was
work?
like, is it gonna work? But
Yeah, no, well done. Make sure to tell Man you got the premium one to get reimbursed.
Oh no, I got the trial version.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it's taken money off, but I presume that once I can't cancel, it'll refund the money. So
Yeah.
it should be fine.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. Well, thank you again, and I'll talk to you maybe over the weekend if you have time. We can do a weekly meeting or something.
Yeah, I might.
Maybe
might be
next week
busy
is fine, because we've met
Yeah.
with Aman this week anyway. So
Yeah. Just I don't know what. Honestly, I've just signed up to way too much stuff. I'm just clogging up the backlog right now, because I'm doing the Remembrance Day parade on Sunday. So
Okay,
we've
yeah.
got like practice for that and stuff.
Yeah,
then I
don't
need to
worry.
polish my
Totally
shoes.
understandable. Let's talk then next week.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will start emailing more people. I've been a bit bogged down this week, but
No, don't worry. Practically, I forgot to
but
tell
also,
you.
yeah, I think we have a lot of people already, don't we?
Yeah,
So-
no, but essentially we have 2 people confirmed for Lent, but also Killian, you know, the guy who was asked
Yeah.
the question. He's in the research group and they do a really similar thing. So he asked if we can join Tech Talk with their thing and just make it Tech Talk a workshop and discussion group from
that
both
would be really
teams.
cool.
So he joined today to kind of see, and then he's recruiting one more person from his team to join us and organize Tech Talk together.
Oh, that's
So
wonderful.
I'm still waiting for him to organize, and I think by next week we should have kind of a team and organize our first call. And so I was thinking to wait before we contact any more speakers to give them an opportunity to contact people they are interested in as well.
Yeah, cool. I mean,
so-
that sounds amazing.
Yeah. So
Very
we can
ideal.
don't stress contacting
Cool.
speakers. We can think about it.
I guess it might be good to contact people for the designathon though.
Exactly. What
Because-
definitely needs to be done is contact judges. We want like 4 to 5 judges, I guess. I've contacted 2 people, but one hasn't replied and one can't. So
Cool. Yeah. I mean, we've got time for that, so it's not too bad.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so essentially I'll update you on the Tech Talk, but for now I'd say.
And also, the presentation looks excellent on the designathon. The brief, I've had a look over and it looks very nice.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna write a bit more about the prompt, like a bit more information. But the idea was like give out 2 A4 papers. One was kind of an explanation of the prompt and like the design process, and the second one was kind of like a list of deliverables that we're waiting for, like the judges would be expecting, like a feasibility analysis, like a cost analysis. Like we want projects that are actually feasible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Have a nice
Okay.
rest of the evening then.
Yeah.
And I'll catch you
You
later.
too. And then I'll talk to you next week.
Cool.
Bye,
Bye.
Agno. Thank you.